in the vast expanse of the galaxy where ancient alien empires span thousands of star systems and technology beyond human comprehension shapes reality itself, there exists a simple truth that few dare to acknowledge. Sometimes the most primitive species can possess the rarest quality of all, unwavering loyalty. When humanity first stumbled into the galactic community, they were dismissed as another barbaric species from a backwater world. No advanced energy manipulation, no telepathic abilities, no natural armor or enhanced lifespans, just flesh and blood creatures with an odd tendency to form unbreakable bonds and an even stranger habit of keeping their promises no matter the cost. The Zephyrian Empire had ruled for 3 millennia, their crystalline cities floating among the stars, their princess the most protected being in known space. They had energy shields that could deflect plasma cannon fire, quantum barriers that bent space itself, and guardian constructs forged from pure thought. They had everything except one thing, someone who would stand between danger and their most precious treasure, not because of programming, duty, or fear, but because of something far more dangerous and unpredictable, because of choice. This is the story of Marcus Chen, a human security specialist who made a split-second decision that would reshape an empire, challenge the foundations of galactic politics, and prove that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in what you can destroy, but in what you're willing to protect. The energy bolt seared through the air where Princess Lyrelei had been standing just moments before, leaving a smoking crater in the crystalline wall behind her. Marcus Chen didn't think thinking would have gotten them both killed. His body moved on pure instinct, developed through years of training in Earth's military and honed during his 6 months as part of the Zephyrian Empire's newly integrated alien security force. Time seemed to stretch as Marcus threw himself between the princess and the second assassin, feeling the heat of another energy discharge burn past his shoulder. The Zephyrian Royal Guard, with all their advanced technology and centuries of training, had been caught completely off guard. Their quantum barriers had been specifically designed to stop conventional weapons, not the primitive but effective projectile rifles that the assassins had somehow smuggled into the palace. "Stay down!" Marcus shouted to Princess Lyrelei, his voice cutting through the chaos as more shots rang out. The princess, despite her royal upbringing and typically calm demeanor, had the good sense to follow the human's orders. She pressed herself against the floor, her iridescent blue skin paling to almost white with fear. The attackers were Korthak rebels, a militant faction from the Outer Rim territories that had been protesting the Empire's expansion policies for decades. They had somehow bypassed every security measure, every energy shield, every quantum lock that protected the royal palace. But they hadn't counted on the unpredictability of human tactics. Marcus rolled behind ornate pillar, pulling out his sidearm, a simple ballistic weapon that most of the galactic community considered primitive. While the Royal Guard scrambled to recalibrate their defenses against the unexpected projectile weapons, Marcus was already moving, using cover and concealment techniques that seemed almost alien to the Zephyrians, despite being developed on a world they considered backward. "Human, what are you doing?" called out Captain Thoric, the head of the Royal Guard, his voice filled with panic as he tried to coordinate his troops. "The security protocols demand that you escort the princess to the safe room immediately." "The safe room they already breached?" Marcus called back, firing 2 precise shots that forced the leading assassin to duck behind his own cover. "I don't think so, Captain." Sometimes the best defense is making sure the threat can't follow through. Princess Lyrelei watched in fascination and terror as the human moved with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the chaotic situation around them. She had studied various alien species as part of her royal education, but seeing human combat doctrine in action was something entirely different from reading about it in academic texts. Where Zephyrian tactics relied on overwhelming firepower and technological superiority, Marcus seemed to blend into the environment itself, using shadows, reflections, and misdirection to confuse his opponents. The first assassin made the mistake of assuming that human weapons had the same limitations as their own energy-based arms. He stepped out from cover, confident that his personal shield would absorb whatever primitive projectile the human might fire. The bullet passed through his energy barrier like it didn't exist and struck him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a decorative fountain. "Impossible," breathed Captain Thoric. "Their shields should stop any kinetic projectile." "Only if the projectile has an energy signature for the shield to read," Marcus replied, taking down the second assassin with a shot to the leg. "Sometimes the old ways work because nobody remembers to defend against them." The third and final assassin, seeing his companions fall, made a desperate decision. Instead of continuing to target the princess, he turned his weapon toward Marcus. The human had no energy shields, no quantum barriers, no advanced armor beyond the simple Kevlar vest he wore under his uniform. He was completely vulnerable to the alien weapon's energy discharge. Princess Lyrelay saw the assassin's intention before Marcus did. Without thinking, she grabbed a ceremonial crystal from a nearby display and hurled it at the attacker. The crystal struck him in the head, disrupting his aim just enough that the energy bolt passed harmlessly over Marcus's shoulder. "Nice throw, Your Highness," Marcus said with a grin that seemed entirely inappropriate for the life-threatening situation they had just survived. "I have excellent hand-eye coordination," the princess replied, her voice shaky but trying to match the human's casual tone. The royal guards finally managed to secure the area, binding the wounded assassins and beginning their investigation into how the palace's security had been compromised so completely. Captain Thoric approached Marcus with an expression that mixed gratitude with bewilderment. "Human Marcus Chen," the captain said formally, "your actions today prevented a catastrophic breach of royal security. The Empire owes you a debt of gratitude." "Just doing my job, Captain," Marcus replied, but he could see something changing in the way the Zephyrians looked at him. Before today, he had been just another alien security specialist, brought in as part of the Empire's diversity initiative to better understand the various species within their territory. Now he was something else entirely. Princess Lyrelay stood slowly brushing dust from her formal robes. She looked at Marcus with eyes that seemed to see him clearly for the first time since he had been assigned to the palace detail 6 months ago. During that time, their interactions had been purely professional. She gave orders, he followed them, maintaining the proper distance between royalty and hired security. "Marcus," she said, and he noticed that she had dropped his rank and surname. "Walk with me." The princess led him through the palace corridors, past tapestries depicting the great victories of Zephyrian history and statues of ancient emperors who had expanded the empire across star systems. Marcus had walked these halls hundreds of times during his security rounds, but something felt different now. The other palace staff they passed looked at him with a mixture of respect and curiosity that hadn't been there before. "Tell me," Princess Lyrelay said as they reached a balcony overlooking the capital city, "why did you choose to stand between me and those weapons instead of following standard protocol?" Marcus considered the question carefully. In his months serving in the palace, he had learned that Zephyrians valued precision and logic above all else. Random acts of heroism weren't part of their cultural framework, and he suspected that his actions today had confused as much as they had impressed. "Protocol assumed that our security measures would hold," he said finally. "When they didn't, protocol became irrelevant. At that point, the mission objective was clear: ensure your safety by any means necessary. But you could have been killed," she pointed out. "A dead security specialist cannot protect anyone." "A dead princess doesn't need protecting," Marcus replied with typical human directness. The princess was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the city where millions of Zephyrians went about their daily lives, unaware of how close their empire had come to losing its heir today. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that Marcus had never heard before. In all my years, through all my training and education, I have never seen anyone make such a decision so quickly and with such certainty, she said. My guards are programmed to protect me. My advisors are bound by oath and tradition. But you chose to put yourself at risk for someone you barely know. I know enough, Marcus said simply. What do you know? Marcus turned to face her fully, and she was struck again by how different human expressions were from Zephyrian ones. Where her people communicated through subtle changes in skin tone and carefully controlled vocal modulation, humans seemed to broadcast their emotions through dozens of tiny facial movements. I know that you spend 4 hours every morning reading reports from the outer territories, not because it's your duty, but because you genuinely care about people you've never met, Marcus said. I know that you convinced your father to expand the food distribution programs to refugee settlements even when the Treasury advisors said it wasn't cost-effective. I know that you learned the names of every staff member in the palace, from the senior advisors down to the maintenance crews. The princess stared at him in surprise. These weren't the kinds of observations that typically appeared in security briefings or official reports. I know, Marcus continued, that someone like that is worth protecting, regardless of titles or bloodlines or political implications. For the first time in her life, Princess Lirelai found herself at a complete loss for words. In Zephyrian culture, relationships were based on clearly defined roles and mutual benefit. The concept of someone risking their life based purely on their personal assessment of her character was so foreign that she had no framework for understanding it. This is why humans concern the High Council, she said finally, because we don't follow predictable patterns, because you make decisions based on factors that our computers cannot calculate, she replied. How does one account for personal loyalty in strategic planning? How does one predict the actions of beings who might choose to act against their own rational self-interest? Marcus smiled, and again the princess was struck by how the simple expression seemed to convey layers of meaning that Zephyrian communication could only approximate. Maybe that's exactly why you need us around, he said. That evening, as reports of the assassination attempt spread throughout the Empire, something unprecedented happened. For the first time in Zephyrian history, a member of the royal family requested that a specific individual be assigned as her personal protector, not because of their qualifications or technological capabilities, but because of a single moment of instinctive courage. The request would work its way through layers of bureaucracy, political analysis, and security reviews. It would be debated, questioned, and examined from every possible angle. But Princess Lirelai had made her decision, and she was prepared to defend it with the same certainty that Marcus had shown when he placed himself between her and danger. The human had stood between the princess and death without hesitation. Now she was prepared to stand between him and anyone who questioned whether that loyalty deserved to be returned. The galaxy was about to learn that when humans formed bonds, they didn't break easily. And when those bonds were reciprocated by someone with the power to shape an empire, the consequences could reshape the stars themselves. 3 weeks after the assassination attempt, Marcus Chen found himself standing in the most secure conference room in the Zephyrian Empire, facing a panel of officials whose combined authority could reshape entire star systems. The High Council chamber was an architectural marvel, with walls that seemed to bend light itself and a ceiling that displayed real-time images of the Empire's territories scattered across the galaxy. Security Specialist Chen began Counselor Vexahai, her crystalline features reflecting the chamber's ambient glow. Your actions during the recent security breach have created what we might call a diplomatic complication. Marcus stood at attention, his human military training serving him well in this formal setting. He had expected this meeting ever since Princess Lirelai had submitted her formal request to have him assigned as her permanent personal protector. In the 3 weeks since the attack, he had noticed subtle changes in how palace staff interacted with him, some with increased respect, others with obvious suspicion. "I'm not sure I understand the nature of the complication, Counselor," Marcus replied carefully. Counselor Threnok, whose species resembled a cross between a tree and a geometric crystal formation, activated a holographic display that filled the center of the room. "The complication, human, is that your species was not admitted to the Empire as potential royal guards. You were accepted as part of our cultural exchange and diversity programs, nothing more." The holographic display showed statistical analyses, psychological profiles, and threat assessments that Marcus recognized as standard xenological evaluation protocols. What surprised him was seeing his own face among the data streams along with detailed breakdowns of his actions during the assassination attempt. "According to our predictive models," continued Counselor Threnok, "your intervention had only a 23.7% chance of success and a 76.8% probability of resulting in your own death along with that of Princess Lyrelay. By all rational calculations, you should have followed established protocol and evacuated the princess to a secure location." "The secure location had already been compromised," Marcus pointed out. "Following protocol would have led both of us directly into a trap." "Precisely the problem," said Counselor Vexhai. "How did you know this when our most advanced tactical computers had not yet reached that conclusion?" Marcus considered his response carefully. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't really about his qualifications or the princess's safety. This was about something much more fundamental, the way humans made decisions that didn't fit into Zephyrian logical frameworks. "I didn't know," he admitted. "I made an educated guess based on incomplete information and acted on instinct." The silence that followed his words was deafening. Several council members exchanged what Marcus had learned were the Zephyrian equivalent of concerned glances, subtle shifts in skin coloration that conveyed complex emotional states. "Instinct," repeated Counselor Nulseth, whose species had evolved from aquatic creatures and still retained gills along their elongated necks. "You risked the life of the Empire's heir on instinct?" "I saved the life of the Empire's heir using instinct," Marcus corrected gently. Before any of the council members could respond, the chamber's main entrance dilated to admit Princess Lyrelay. She entered with the confident stride that Marcus had come to associate with her public appearances, but he could see the subtle signs of tension in her posture that most others would miss after months of observing her mannerisms during security briefings. "Honored counselors," she said, her voice carrying the formal tone of royal address. "I hope you will forgive my interruption, but I believe my presence might help clarify the situation we're discussing." "Your Highness," said Counselor Vexhai with carefully controlled diplomacy, "while we appreciate your interest in these proceedings, matters of security protocol are typically handled without royal involvement." Princess Lyrelay took her position at the head of the conference table, and Marcus noticed how the lighting seemed to automatically adjust to highlight her presence. Everything in Zephyrian architecture was designed to reinforce social hierarchies and political structures. "Typically, yes," the princess agreed. "However, this situation is far from typical, wouldn't you agree?" She gestured, and a new holographic display appeared, showing detailed records of every security incident in the royal palace over the past 50 years. Marcus watched as the data revealed patterns he hadn't been aware of. Infiltration attempts, system failures, and protocol breaches that painted a picture of gradually degrading security effectiveness. "Our traditional methods," Princess Lyrelay continued, "while sophisticated and generally effective, have been developed to counter threats from within our own technological framework. The assassination attempt 3 weeks ago succeeded as far as it did because the attackers used primitive weapons and tactics that our systems were not designed to counter." Counselor Threnok's bark-like skin shifted through several color variations before he spoke. "Are you suggesting that we have been negligent in our security preparations, Your Highness?" "Not negligent," she replied smoothly, "but perhaps too focused on the threats we understand while overlooking the ones we don't." Marcus found himself impressed by the princess's political maneuvering. She was defending his actions without directly criticizing the Council's security policies, walking a diplomatic tightrope that required incredible precision. "The question before us," said Counselor Nalseth, "is whether human Chen's unpredictable methods make him a valuable asset or a dangerous variable that could compromise future security operations." "With respect, Counselor," Marcus said, stepping forward slightly, "I think you're asking the wrong question." The chamber fell silent again, and Marcus realized that he had just interrupted a High Council member, something that was probably considered a serious breach of protocol. But he had Princess Lyralay's safety to consider, and political niceties seemed secondary to that primary objective. "Please elaborate," said Counselor Vexai, her tone suggesting that his next words had better be worth the breach in protocol. "You're trying to determine whether I fit into your existing security framework," Marcus said, "but the real question is whether your existing security framework is adequate for the threats you're actually facing." He gestured toward the holographic displays still floating around the room. "Every security system you've developed assumes that attackers will use technology and tactics similar to your own, but what happens when someone shows up with weapons that don't register on your sensors and strategies that don't appear in your tactical databases? Human military doctrine includes extensive training in what they call asymmetric warfare, conflicts where opposing forces use vastly different approaches and capabilities. And you believe this perspective would benefit our security operations?" asked Counselor Threnok. "I believe," said the princess, "that the attempt on my life 3 weeks ago proved that our security operations need perspectives that think outside our traditional parameters." Marcus watched the council members process this information, their various alien features displaying what he was learning to recognize as deep contemplation. Zephyrian decision-making involved extensive analysis and consultation, which made their ability to reach consensus remarkable, but also meant that critical decisions could take much longer than humans typically preferred. "There is another consideration," said Counselor Nalseth finally. "The political implications of assigning a non-Zephyrian as personal protector to the royal heir are significant." "How so?" asked Princess Lyralay. "It suggests that our own people are inadequate for the task," replied Counselor Vexai. "It could undermine confidence in our institutions and create diplomatic tensions with species who might view such an appointment as preferential treatment for humans." Marcus felt a familiar frustration building, the kind he had experienced during his military service when political considerations seemed to override practical necessities. But he had learned to work within bureaucratic systems, and he suspected that direct confrontation would not serve the princess's interests. "Counselors," he said, carefully, "what if we approached this differently? Instead of focusing on whether I'm qualified to be a royal protector, what if we considered how my background might complement your existing security capabilities?" "Explain," said Counselor Threnok. "Your security forces are highly trained and technologically advanced, but they all think in similar patterns because they're all trained in the same systems," Marcus said. "I don't think like a Zephyrian, which means I might notice threats that your people would miss simply because those threats don't fit expected patterns. Like using projectile weapons in a palace designed to stop energy discharges." "Exactly. I'm not suggesting that I replace your security protocols. I'm suggesting that I add a different perspective to them." The council members conferred among themselves in rapid Zephyrian, their conversation too fast and complex for Marcus to follow even with his basic understanding of the language. Princess Lyralay listened intently, her expression revealing nothing about how she thought the discussion was proceeding. Finally, Counselor Vex's High turned back to face them. "Security Specialist Chen, your argument has merit. However, the appointment you seek comes with responsibilities that extend far beyond personal protection." "I understand that, Counselor. Do you?" asked Counselor Nalseth. "A royal protector is not merely a bodyguard. They become part of the royal household, privy to state secrets, involved in diplomatic functions, and responsible for making security decisions that could affect the stability of the empire itself. Marcus looked at Princess Lyrelay, seeing in her expression a question about whether he truly understood what he was committing to. The truth was, he hadn't fully considered the broader implications when he had thrown himself between her and those energy bolts. He had simply seen someone in danger and reacted accordingly. But now, standing in this chamber with the weight of the Empire's political machinery focused on him, he was beginning to understand that his split-second decision had set in motion consequences that would reshape his entire life. "Counselors," he said finally, 3 weeks ago I made a decision based on what I believed was right without considering the political ramifications or career implications. If you're asking whether I'm prepared to make that same kind of decision again, the answer is yes." Princess Lyrelay smiled, a genuine expression that seemed to light up the entire chamber. "Then we have our answer," she said to the council. "The question isn't whether Marcus fits our existing protocols. The question is whether we're wise enough to adapt our protocols to include the kind of thinking that could prevent the next assassination attempt from getting as far as the last one did." Counselor Vexakai raised her hand, and Marcus recognized the gesture as a call for formal voting. One by one, the council members indicated their positions through the complex series of gestures and vocalizations that constituted official Zephyrian consensus building. When the process was complete, Counselor Vekai looked directly at Marcus. "Security Specialist Chen, by majority consensus of the High Council and at the specific request of Princess Lyrelay, you are hereby appointed to the position of personal protector to the royal heir with all the privileges and responsibilities that position entails." Marcus felt a weight settle on his shoulders that was somehow heavier than any military equipment he had ever carried. He was no longer just a human serving in an alien security force. He was now part of the royal household of an interstellar empire, responsible for protecting not just a person, but a symbol of stability for billions of beings across hundreds of worlds. "Thank you, counselors," he said simply. As the formal session concluded and the council members began to file out of the chamber, Princess Lyrelay approached him with an expression that mixed triumph with something that looked almost like concern. "Are you ready for this, Marcus?" she asked quietly. "Probably not," he admitted. "But I don't think anyone ever really is ready for something like this." "No," she agreed. "They're not. But I think that might be exactly what makes you the right person for the job." Outside the chamber windows, the lights of the capital city stretched toward the horizon, representing millions of lives that depended on the stability and security of the empire. Marcus Chen, former Earth military specialist turned royal protector, looked out at those lights and made a silent promise that he would do everything in his power to keep them safe. He had stood between the princess and danger once. Now, he would spend the rest of his career standing between her and every threat the galaxy could produce, and somewhere deep in his human heart, he knew that he wouldn't have it any other way. 6 months into his new role as personal protector to the royal heir, Marcus Chen was learning that palace politics could be more dangerous than any assassin. The crystalline corridors that had once seemed magnificent now felt like a maze of potential threats, each conversation a minefield of diplomatic implications he was still learning to navigate. "Your presence is requested in the diplomatic wing, Protector Chen," announced Veltar, one of the palace's senior protocol officers, his tone carrying just enough formality to mask what Marcus had learned to recognize as barely concealed disapproval. Marcus looked up from the security briefings he had been reviewing in his new office, a space that still felt surreal after months of adjustment. The walls displayed real-time feeds from hundreds of surveillance points throughout the palace complex, along with threat assessments, diplomatic schedules, and intelligence reports from across the empire. "What's the nature of the diplomatic function?" Marcus asked, closing the holographic files with a gesture he was still getting used to. The Altarian Trade Consortium has requested a formal audience with Princess Lirelei. Beltar replied, his skin showing the subtle color shifts that indicated he found the entire situation distasteful. As her personal protector, your presence is required during all diplomatic meetings. The Altarians were one of the Empire's most important trading partners, but their species had very specific protocols regarding honor, hierarchy, and respect. Having a human, a species they considered primitive, present during formal negotiations was likely to cause significant diplomatic complications. Has the princess been briefed on potential Altarian concerns about my presence? Marcus asked. Veltar's expression grew even more disapproving. Her Highness has made it clear that your security protocols take precedence over diplomatic sensitivities. 20 minutes later, Marcus found himself standing in the palace's most formal reception chamber, watching Princess Lirelei prepare for what could be one of the most challenging diplomatic encounters of her career. She wore the traditional ceremonial robes of state, their iridescent fabric seeming to capture and amplify the chamber's carefully orchestrated lighting. "Are you ready for this?" she asked him quietly, adjusting the ceremonial sash that marked her status as royal heir. "I'm more concerned about whether you're ready for this," Marcus replied. "The Altarians aren't going to be subtle about their displeasure with having me here." Princess Lirelei turned to face him fully, and Marcus was struck by how much she had changed in the months since the assassination attempt. The uncertainty and fear he had seen in her eyes that day had been replaced by a confidence that seemed to grow stronger with each political challenge she faced. "Marcus," she said, "do you remember what you told me the day we first met? About knowing enough to make the decision to protect me, I remember." "Well, now I know enough about you to make my own decisions," she said with a smile that didn't quite hide the steel underneath, "and I've decided that anyone who has a problem with my choice of protector can take their concerns up with me directly." The chamber's main entrance dilated, and the Altarian delegation entered with the formal precision that characterized all their public appearances. Ambassador Ketmar led the group, his towering form covered in the metallic scales that had evolved to protect his species on their high-radiation homeworld. Behind him came a retinue of trade officials, security personnel, and cultural advisors, all moving in the synchronized formation that Altarians used to demonstrate unity and strength. Marcus positioned himself according to the diplomatic protocols he had been studying for months, close enough to intervene if necessary, far enough away to avoid suggesting that the princess needed protection from her guests. The balance was delicate, and he could see from the subtle reactions of the Altarian delegation that his mere presence was already causing the kind of diplomatic tension everyone had feared. "Your Highness," Ambassador Ketmar said, his voice carrying the harmonic overtones that made Altarian formal speech sound almost musical, "the Trade Consortium extends its gratitude for this audience and hopes that our continued partnership will bring prosperity to both our peoples." "Ambassador," Princess Lirelei replied with equal formality, "the Empire values our relationship with the Altarian Consortium and looks forward to discussing the expansion of our mutual trade agreements." The initial pleasantries proceeded according to established diplomatic protocols, but Marcus could sense the underlying tension in the room. The Altarian delegates kept glancing in his direction with expressions that clearly indicated their discomfort with his presence. Their culture placed enormous emphasis on what they called appropriate hierarchies, and having what they considered a primitive species standing guard over royalty violated their fundamental understanding of proper order. "If I may," Ambassador Ketmar said after the formal greetings had concluded, "the consortium has some concerns about recent changes in the Empire's security arrangements." Princess Lirelei's expression didn't change, but Marcus caught the subtle shift in her posture that indicated she was preparing for confrontation. "What specific concerns does the consortium have, Ambassador?" "We understand that recent events have necessitated adjustments to your personal security," the ambassador continued diplomatically, "but the consortium's member worlds are somewhat confused by the decision to place a representative of such a recently contacted species in such a sensitive position. Marcus felt the familiar tension that had become a constant companion since accepting his new role. This wasn't about his qualifications or capabilities. It was about the political implications of his species being elevated to a position of trust within the Empire's power structure. "Ambassador," Princess Lyrelay said with carefully controlled calm, "are you questioning the Empire's judgment in matters of internal security?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Challenging the Empire's internal decisions could be interpreted as a serious diplomatic insult, but the Altarians had clearly come prepared to push this issue as far as necessary. "Not at all, Your Highness," Ambassador Ketmar replied smoothly. However, the consortium's member worlds invest significant resources in their relationship with the Empire based on confidence in the Empire's stability and traditional values. When those traditions change rapidly, traditions change when circumstances require them to change, Marcus said quietly, speaking for the first time since the meeting had begun. The silence that followed was deafening. A member of the security detail had just interrupted a formal diplomatic exchange, something that was unprecedented in Zephyrian protocol. Marcus could see Veltar's horrified expression in his peripheral vision and knew that he had just committed what would be considered a major diplomatic breach. But he could also see something else in Princess Lyrelay's expression. Not anger or embarrassment, but curiosity about where he was going with this unprecedented intervention. "Please continue," she said calmly, giving him explicit permission to speak further. Marcus stepped forward slightly, maintaining appropriate respect for the diplomatic setting while making it clear that he was speaking as more than just a silent guardian. "Ambassador," he said, addressing Ketmar directly, "I understand the consortium's concerns about rapid changes in traditional practices. But I think there might be a misunderstanding about what actually changed." "How so?" the ambassador asked, his tone suggesting that he was prepared to listen but remained skeptical. "The Empire's commitment to protecting its royal family hasn't changed," Marcus said. "The methods used to fulfill that commitment have been updated to address new types of threats. The assassination attempt 6 months ago succeeded as far as it did because the attackers used tactics that traditional security measures weren't designed to counter." He gestured to the chamber around them with its advanced energy shields and quantum-encrypted communication systems. "All of this technology is designed to stop attacks that follow predictable patterns. But what happens when attackers don't follow those patterns?" Ambassador Ketmar's scales shifted color slightly. What Marcus had learned was the Altarian equivalent of thoughtful consideration. "You are suggesting that your unconventional approach provides security benefits that traditional methods cannot." "I'm suggesting that effective security requires multiple approaches," Marcus replied. "Your own trade convoys use both advanced shield technology and traditional escort formations because different threats require different responses." Princess Lyrelay stepped forward, building on Marcus's diplomatic opening. "The Empire's security arrangements reflect the same principle. We maintain all of our traditional protective measures while adding new capabilities to address evolving threats." The ambassador was quiet for a long moment, his retinue waiting for his response with the patient discipline that characterized Altarian group dynamics. Marcus could see him processing the conversation, weighing political implications against practical considerations. "Your Highness," he said finally, "the consortium appreciates the explanation. However, our member worlds remain concerned about the precedent this sets regarding the elevation of recently contacted species to positions of significant authority." "Ambassador," Princess Lyrelay said with the edge to her voice that Marcus had rarely heard before, "are you suggesting that the Empire should make security decisions based on species prejudice rather than individual capability? By framing the issue in terms of prejudice versus merit, The princess had forced the ambassador into a position where any continued objections would make the Altarians appear to be advocating discrimination. Ambassador Ketmar's scales cycled through several color changes before he responded. Of course not, Your Highness. The consortium values merit above all other considerations. Then I'm sure you'll understand why Protector Chen was chosen for his current position, she said smoothly. His actions during the assassination attempt demonstrated exactly the kind of merit-based thinking that should guide such decisions. Marcus watched the diplomatic dance with growing appreciation for the princess's political skills. She had taken what could have been a devastating challenge to the Empire's credibility and turned it into an opportunity to demonstrate the Empire's commitment to evaluating individuals based on their capabilities rather than their species of origin. Perhaps, suggested one of the ambassador's advisors, the Protector could provide more details about the security improvements his unique perspective has brought to the Royal Protection Protocols. It was clearly a test designed to determine whether Marcus could justify his position with concrete examples rather than abstract principles. Marcus glanced at Princess Lyrelei, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Since the assassination attempt, Marcus said, we've implemented several new security measures based on what humans call red team thinking, imagining how attackers might circumvent existing defenses. He activated a holographic display that showed the palace's security grid. We've added random patrols that don't follow predictable patterns, installed backup sensors that use different detection methods than our primary systems, and created response protocols for attacks that use primitive or unexpected weapons. The display showed statistical improvements in threat detection and response times that were impressive by any measure. More importantly, we've trained existing security personnel to think beyond their normal tactical parameters. These improvements are significant. Have they been tested under actual threat conditions? 3 weeks ago, Princess Lyrelei said, Palace security detected and neutralized a surveillance drone that had been gathering intelligence on our defensive arrangements. The drone was using obsolete technology that our primary sensors classified as harmless debris, but the backup systems flagged it for investigation, Marcus added, because it was moving in patterns that didn't match natural debris drift. The Altarian delegation exchanged glances that Marcus was learning to interpret as their version of impressed approval. Their culture respected practical results above theoretical arguments, and the concrete improvements in security effectiveness were difficult to dismiss. Your Highness, Ambassador Ketmar said, after conferring briefly with his advisors, the consortium acknowledges that these security improvements represent valuable innovations. We also recognize that the Empire's internal security arrangements are not subject to external approval. Thank you for that clarification, Ambassador, Princess Lyrelei replied. However, the ambassador continued, we hope that future diplomatic protocols can be developed to address the concerns of species who may not be familiar with these new arrangements. Marcus realized that this was the Altarians' way of asking for advance notice when human-influenced policies might affect their interactions with the Empire. It was a reasonable compromise that allowed them to save face while accepting the changes they couldn't prevent. The Empire is always willing to work with our partners to ensure clear communication about our policies and procedures, Princess Lyrelei said diplomatically. The remainder of the meeting proceeded much more smoothly, with both sides working through the details of expanded trade agreements and diplomatic protocols. Marcus remained alert but began to relax as the immediate crisis passed and normal negotiations resumed. As the Altarian delegation prepared to leave, Ambassador Ketmar approached Marcus directly for the first time. Protector Chen, he said formally, the consortium wishes you success in your duties. Thank you, Ambassador, Marcus replied. Perhaps, the ambassador added quietly, there is wisdom in learning from species who think differently than we do. After the delegation had departed, Marcus found himself alone with Princess Lyrelei in the reception chamber. She was removing the formal ceremonial elements of her outfit, and he could see the relief in her posture as the diplomatic tension finally dissipated. "That could have gone much worse," she said with a tired smile. "That could have gone much better," Marcus replied. "I probably shouldn't have spoken without permission." Princess Liraile laughed, a sound that Marcus had heard more frequently in recent months but that still seemed to transform her entire demeanor. "Marcus," she said, "6 months ago you threw yourself between me and energy weapons without asking permission. Did you really think I'd be upset about you defending our security policies without asking permission?" "Point taken," he said with a grin. "Besides," she continued, "you handled that exactly the way I hoped you would. You turned a political attack into a practical discussion about security effectiveness. That's the kind of thinking that makes you valuable as more than just a protector." Marcus looked at her with curiosity. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Princess Liraile said, "that the Empire needs advisors who can think outside our traditional frameworks. Today proved that your perspective has value beyond personal protection." As they walked back toward the palace's residential wing, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that split-second decision to step between the princess and danger. He had thought he was simply accepting a job as a bodyguard. Instead, he had become part of a political transformation that was reshaping how the Empire thought about diversity, merit, and the value of different perspectives. The human who had once been dismissed as a primitive species representative was now helping to guide the foreign policy decisions of an interstellar empire. And judging by the princess's expression as she reviewed the day's diplomatic victory, this was only the beginning of the changes his presence would bring to the galaxy's oldest and most powerful civilization. The emergency klaxon that pierced the pre-dawn quiet of the royal palace was unlike anything Marcus had heard in his 18 months as personal protector to Princess Liraile. This wasn't the sharp, focused alarm of a security breach or the rhythmic pattern that indicated a drill. This was the deep, resonating tone that meant only one thing: the Empire itself was under threat. Marcus was already moving before he was fully awake, his training taking over as he grabbed his equipment and activated his communication link. "Control, this is Protector Chen. What's the nature of the emergency?" "Multiple fleet incursions across the Outer Rim territories," came the reply from Captain Thoric, his voice tight with stress. "The hegemony has launched a coordinated assault on 17 different systems simultaneously." The Zarathan hegemony had been the Empire's primary rival for over 2 centuries, controlling a territory roughly equal in size to Zephyrian space but with a fundamentally different approach to governance. Where the Empire relied on diplomatic alliances and trade partnerships, the hegemony expanded through conquest and subjugation. The two powers had maintained an uneasy peace for decades, but intelligence reports had been suggesting for months that the hegemony was preparing for major military action. Marcus reached Princess Liraile's quarters to find her already dressed and reviewing holographic battle reports that filled her private study. The displays showed a galaxy-spanning map with red indicators marking hegemony fleet positions and Imperial forces scrambling to respond to attacks across dozens of star systems. "How bad is it?" Marcus asked, positioning himself where he could monitor both the entrance and the tactical displays. "Bad enough that the High Council has activated the succession protocols," Princess Liraile replied without looking away from the battle reports. "If the capital comes under direct attack, I'm to be evacuated immediately to the emergency command center in the Deneb system." Marcus studied the tactical situation, his human military experience helping him interpret patterns that might not be immediately obvious to Zephyrian strategic thinking. What he saw made his blood run cold. "Your Highness," he said carefully, "I think this might be a diversion." She turned to look at him with the sharp attention he had learned to associate with her most serious moments. "Explain." "Look at the pattern of attacks," Marcus said, highlighting specific fleet positions on the display. "They're hitting our outer territories hard, but they're not following up with ground invasions or attempting to hold territory. It's like they want our fleets as far away from the core systems as possible. Princess Lyreley studied the new perspective Marcus had provided, her expression growing increasingly troubled. You think the real target is here? The capital? I think the real target is you, Marcus said bluntly. Before she could respond, Captain Thoric's voice crackled through the communication system with barely controlled panic. Your Highness, we have multiple hegemony stealth ships dropping out of hyperspace within the system. They're heading directly for the capital. The palace's defensive systems activated automatically, energy barriers rising around the complex while automated weapon systems came online. Through the study's crystalline windows, Marcus could see the familiar shimmer of energy shields as they encased the entire governmental district. Estimated time until arrival? Princess Lyreley asked with remarkable calm considering the circumstances. 47 minutes at current approach vector, Captain Thoric replied. Imperial fleets are moving to intercept, but the nearest significant force is still 3 hours away. Princess Lyreley stood and moved toward the secure communications array that would allow her to coordinate with military commanders across the Empire. Begin evacuation procedures for all non-essential personnel. Alert the High Council that we're implementing emergency protocols. Your Highness, Marcus said quietly, we need to get you to the evacuation site now. I'm not leaving, she said without hesitation. Ma'am, the succession protocols exist specifically for situations like this. If something happens to you, if something happens to me while I'm running away from the capital during the Empire's greatest crisis in 2 centuries, it won't matter who takes the throne. She interrupted. The government will have lost all credibility. Marcus felt the familiar frustration of dealing with someone whose sense of duty outweighed their survival instincts. It was a trait he admired and one that made his job exponentially more difficult. Then we make sure nothing happens to you while you're not running away, he said finally. The next hour passed in controlled chaos as the palace transformed from a center of government into a fortress under siege. Imperial defenders took positions throughout the complex, while civilian staff evacuated through secured tunnels that led to underground transport systems. The energy barriers around the governmental district were reinforced by portable shield generators, and automated defense turrets emerged from concealed positions throughout the city. Marcus coordinated with the defensive preparations while maintaining constant awareness of Princess Lyreley's location. She had established herself in the palace's primary command center, working with military advisors and High Council members to coordinate the Empire's response to the multi-system assault. Protector Chen, she called out as he completed his security sweep of the command center. I need your assessment of our defensive capabilities. Marcus studied the tactical displays showing the palace's defensive arrangements. What he saw was impressive by any standard. Energy barriers that could stop capital ship weapons, automated defense systems with overlapping fields of fire, and underground bunkers that could withstand direct orbital bombardment. Our static defenses are excellent, he said, but they're designed to stop conventional attacks. If the hegemony has been planning this assault for months, they've probably developed countermeasures. What kind of countermeasures? Asked General Korthok, the senior military advisor whose species had evolved from apex predators and retained the instincts to match. The same kind we faced during the assassination attempt, Marcus replied. Attacks that bypass our technological advantages by using methods we haven't prepared for. As if summoned by his words, the first wave of hegemony assault craft appeared on the defensive sensors. But instead of the expected energy weapons and guided missiles, the attackers were using kinetic projectiles and electromagnetic pulse weapons that could disrupt but not destroy the palace's energy barriers. They're not trying to break through our shields, observed Princess Lyreley. They're trying to overload them. And while our power systems are cycling back online, Marcus added, they'll send in ground forces using conventional weapons that won't trigger our automated defenses. The attack unfolded exactly as Marcus had predicted. Wave after wave of kinetic projectiles hammered the palace's energy barriers, forcing the defensive systems to draw ever-increasing amounts of power from the facility's generators. When the shields finally collapsed from overload, hegemony assault troops poured through the gaps using weapons and tactics that the palace's automated defenses had trouble identifying and targeting. "All personnel to defensive positions," ordered General Korthak as hegemony forces breached the outer perimeter. "Protect the command center at all costs." Marcus found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to split his attention between coordinating with the defensive effort and maintaining his primary responsibility for Princess Lyralei's safety. The command center was the most secure location in the palace, but it was also the most obvious target for any assault force. "Your Highness," he said, during a brief lull in the communications traffic, "we should consider moving to one of the secondary command posts." "This is where I need to be," she replied without looking away from the tactical displays. "The Empire's military commanders need to know that the government is still functioning." The fighting reached the palace's inner complex 20 minutes later, with hegemony assault troops using the same tunnels and service corridors that the civilian evacuees had used earlier. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. The evacuation routes designed to protect the palace's occupants were now being used to attack them. "Contact with the eastern defensive positions has been lost," reported Captain Thorick, his voice strained by the intensity of the battle raging throughout the complex. "Hegemony forces have reached the residential wing," added another voice from the communication system. "They're advancing toward the governmental section." Marcus made a decision that he knew Princess Lyrelei wouldn't like, but that had become unavoidable given the tactical situation. He activated his personal communicator and began issuing orders to the scattered Imperial defenders. "All units, this is Protector Chen. Fall back to secondary defensive positions around the command center. Do not attempt to hold the outer sections. Concentrate your forces on the core areas." "Marcus," Princess Lyrelei said sharply, "those outer sections contain critical governmental offices and historical artifacts that cannot be replaced." "Your Highness," Marcus replied with respect but firm determination, "those things can be rebuilt or recovered." "You cannot—" The tactical display showed Imperial forces falling back according to Marcus's orders, creating a defensive perimeter around the command center that was smaller but much more concentrated. The hegemony assault troops found themselves facing increasingly fierce resistance as they approached the heart of the palace complex. "Ingenious," observed General Korthak, studying the new defensive arrangement. "By contracting our perimeter, we've created overlapping fields of fire that the attackers cannot avoid." "It's a temporary solution," Marcus warned. "Once they realize what we're doing, they'll adapt their approach." As if responding to his words, the hegemony forces outside the command center stopped their direct assault and began deploying what appeared to be siege equipment. Energy weapons designed to cut through reinforced barriers and automated systems that could bypass electronic locks. "They're preparing for a sustained assault on the command center itself," reported Captain Thorick. Princess Lyrelei stood and moved toward the command center's main tactical display, her expression showing the kind of calm determination that Marcus had learned to associate with her most dangerous decisions. "General Korthak," she said formally, "what is the status of Imperial fleet movements?" "The nearest significant force is still 90 minutes out," the general replied. "However, we have received confirmation that Admiral Vextar's battle group is moving to intercept the hegemony fleet in orbit. And if Admiral Vextar fails to break through," the general's predatory features showed what Marcus interpreted as grim acknowledgement. "Then we hold this position until relief arrives or until we cannot hold it any longer." "Unacceptable," Princess Lyrelei said firmly. "I will not allow the Empire's capital to fall because its leadership was trapped in a single location." Before anyone could ask what she meant, alarms began sounding throughout the command center as the hegemony siege weapons began their assault on the facility's final barriers. The energy discharges were visible through the reinforced windows as beams of coherent light carved through layers of crystalline armor and defensive shielding. "Barrier integrity at 60% and falling," reported the facility's automated systems. Marcus looked at the tactical situation and realized that traditional defensive thinking was about to get everyone in the command center killed. The hegemony forces had successfully trapped the Empire's leadership in what amounted to a very sophisticated bunker, and they had all the time in the world to break through the final defenses. "Your Highness," he said, an idea forming that was either brilliant or suicidal, "what if instead of waiting for them to break through our defenses, we broke through theirs?" Princess Lyrelay turned to look at him with an expression that mixed curiosity with concern. "Explain." "They've concentrated their forces around the command center because they know we're trapped here," Marcus said. "But what if we weren't trapped? What if we were exactly where we wanted to be?" He gestured to the tactical display, highlighting the positions of hegemony forces surrounding their location. "They've created the perfect ambush setup, except they're the ones who walked into it." "A breakout assault while they're focused on siege operations?" "More than that," Marcus replied. "A coordinated attack from inside the palace while Admiral Vextar's forces engage them in orbit. They'll be caught between two forces and unable to effectively respond to either." Princess Lyrelay studied the proposal with the analytical thinking that had made her such an effective political leader. "The risk level is enormous. If the breakout fails, we lose the command center's defensive advantages. If we stay here, we lose anyway," Marcus pointed out. "At least this way, we control the timing of the engagement." The barrier integrity warnings continued as the hegemony weapons carved deeper into the command center's defenses. Princess Lyrelay looked around the room at the faces of her advisors and military commanders, seeing in their expressions the same grim determination that had carried the Empire through 2 centuries of challenges. "General Korthak," she said formally, "prepare the remaining defensive forces for coordinated breakout operations." "Your Highness," the general replied with obvious approval, "it will be my pleasure." Marcus positioned himself at Princess Lyrelay's side and made the same silent promise he had made 18 months earlier when he had first stepped between her and danger. Whatever happened in the next hour, she would not face it alone. The war that would reshape the galaxy was about to begin in earnest, and the fate of billions would depend on the courage of a human who had once been dismissed as a primitive species representative and a Zephyrian princess who refused to abandon her people when they needed her most. The breakout from the command center began at precisely the moment when the hegemony forces expected the Imperial defenses to collapse. Instead of finding a defeated leadership cowering behind failing barriers, the attackers found themselves facing a coordinated assault from defenders who had turned their supposed trap into an ambush. Marcus led the first wave through the breach that the hegemony siege weapons had carved in the command center's outer wall. Using the smoke and debris as cover while Princess Lyrelay coordinated the overall assault from a mobile command post that kept her in communication with both the palace defenders and Admiral Vextar's fleet in orbit. "Hegemony forces in the eastern corridor are falling back," reported Captain Thoric as Imperial defenders pressed their advantage throughout the palace complex. They weren't prepared for a coordinated counterattack. The battle raged through corridors that had been designed for diplomatic receptions and governmental ceremonies, not military combat. Priceless artwork and historical artifacts were caught in the crossfire as 2 civilizations fought for control of the Empire's political heart. Marcus found himself thinking that Princess Lyrelay had been right to worry about the irreplaceable treasures being destroyed, even as he acknowledged that preserving the Empire's leadership took priority over preserving its artifacts. "Protector Chen, we have a problem," came Princess Lyrelay's voice through his communication link as he and a squad of Imperial guards cleared the residential wing of hegemony infiltrators. "What kind of problem, Your Highness?" Marcus replied, taking cover behind an ornate pillar as enemy energy bolts scorched the air around him. "Long-range sensors are detecting additional hegemony forces approaching the system. It looks like this assault was just the first wave. So Marcus felt his heart sink as the implications became clear. The Empire's remaining fleets were scattered across the galaxy, responding to diversionary attacks on the Outer Rim territories. Even if Admiral Vextar managed to defeat the current hegemony force, there weren't enough Imperial ships in the core systems to stop a second assault wave. "How long until the reinforcements arrive?" he asked, while directing his squad toward a group of hegemony soldiers who had taken defensive positions in the palace's main library. 6 hours, maybe 7, Princess Lyrelay replied. Admiral Vextar estimates that the current engagement will take at least 3 hours to resolve, assuming everything goes according to plan. And if everything doesn't go according to plan, then we'll be facing a second hegemony assault with minimal orbital support and whatever ground forces we can assemble from the palace's defensive garrison. Marcus processed this information while leading his squad through a tactical maneuver that would have been impossible for Zephyrian forces to execute, but that felt natural to someone trained in human military doctrine. Instead of attempting to overwhelm the enemy positions with superior firepower, they used misdirection and flanking maneuvers to force the hegemony soldiers out of their defensive positions. "Your Highness," he said as the last of the library's attackers surrendered, "I think we need to consider the possibility that holding the capital might not be our primary objective." "Explain," she replied, with the crisp tone that indicated she was prepared to evaluate any tactical option, regardless of how unconventional it might sound. "The hegemony isn't trying to conquer Imperial territory," Marcus said, leading his squad toward the palace's central communications hub, where the heaviest fighting was still continuing. "They're trying to decapitate Imperial leadership. If they can eliminate you and the High Council, the Empire's political structure collapses, even if our military forces remain intact." "So you're suggesting we abandon the capital?" "I'm suggesting we make sure that eliminating Imperial leadership becomes impossible, even if they manage to take the capital." Princess Lyrelay was quiet for several moments while Marcus and his squad engaged a stubborn group of hegemony forces who had barricaded themselves in the communications center. When she finally responded, her voice carried the kind of determined resolve that Marcus had learned to associate with her most consequential decisions. "General Korthak," she said, switching to a channel that included all the senior military commanders, "I want you to begin implementing evacuation protocols for the High Council and essential governmental personnel." "Your Highness," the general replied with obvious confusion, "our current tactical position is improving. The counterattack has been more successful than our most optimistic projections indicated, which is exactly why now is the time to ensure that success doesn't become irrelevant," she said firmly. "If the hegemony's second wave is larger than the first, we need to guarantee that the Empire's government survives regardless of what happens to the capital." Marcus smiled grimly as he realized what Princess Lyrelay was planning. Instead of risking everything on a single desperate defense, she was ensuring that the Empire's political structure would remain intact even if the worst-case scenario occurred. It was the kind of strategic thinking that elevated her from a competent heir to a true leader. The fighting in the communications center intensified as hegemony forces realized that Imperial defenders were trying to establish contact with military units throughout the galaxy. If the Empire could coordinate its scattered fleets, the hegemony's advantage in the core systems would be neutralized by superior numbers from the outer territories. "Marcus," Princess Lyrelay's voice carried a new urgency. "Admiral Vextar is reporting that the hegemony fleet in orbit is larger than initial estimates indicated. He's requesting permission to withdraw and wait for reinforcements." "What did you tell him?" "I told him to hold his position and buy us as much time as possible," she replied. "But if he's forced to retreat, the palace will be completely vulnerable to orbital bombardment," where Imperial technicians were working frantically to restore contact with military commanders across the galaxy while defenders held off increasingly desperate hegemony assault troops. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. They were fighting to preserve the means of communication that would allow them to coordinate their own evacuation. "Your Highness," he said carefully, "I think it's time for you to join the evacuation. Not until we've re-established communication with the Outer Territory fleets," she replied stubbornly. "The technicians can handle the communication protocols without you being physically present," Marcus pointed out, "but they can't handle coordinating the Empire's government if something happens to you." The debate was interrupted by an explosion that shook the entire palace complex as Admiral Vextar's fleet engaged the hegemony forces in orbit. Through the communication center's windows, Marcus could see the brilliant flashes of energy weapon exchanges lighting up the night sky like an aurora of destruction. "Communication link established with the Centauri battle group," reported one of the technicians. "Admiral Karn is requesting immediate orders regarding fleet redeployment." Princess Lorelei moved to the communications console and began issuing the rapid sequence of orders that would coordinate the Empire's military response across dozens of star systems. Marcus watched her work and felt a familiar sense of pride in serving someone who could maintain such focus and clarity under impossible pressure. "Fleet coordination complete," she announced after 20 minutes of intense communication with military commanders throughout the galaxy. "All available Imperial forces are now moving toward the core systems. How long until they arrive?" asked General Kortak. "The fastest ships will reach us in 18 hours, she replied. "The main battle groups will take at least 36 hours. Marcus didn't need to point out that they probably didn't have 18 hours, let alone 36. The sounds of battle throughout the palace were diminishing as Imperial forces gained control of most areas, but that success would be meaningless if the hegemony's second assault wave arrived before Imperial reinforcements. "Your Highness," he said formally, "the evacuation shuttles are standing by. The High Council and essential personnel are ready to depart on your orders." Princess Lorelei looked around the communications center one last time, her expression showing the weight of abandoning the seat of government that her family had occupied for over 8 centuries. But when she spoke, her voice carried absolute determination. "Begin the evacuation," she ordered. All personnel to designated departure points immediately. The evacuation proceeded with the efficiency that characterized all Imperial emergency procedures. High Council members, senior advisors, and essential governmental staff were transported through secure tunnels to underground launch facilities where fast courier ships waited to carry them to the emergency command center in the Deneb system. Marcus remained at Princess Lorelei's side throughout the process, coordinating with the remaining palace defenders while ensuring that the evacuation proceeded without interference from hegemony forces. The attackers seemed to realize what was happening and launched increasingly desperate assaults to prevent the Imperial leadership from escaping. But the defensive perimeter held long enough for the critical personnel to reach their evacuation points. "Final group is away," reported Captain Thoric as the last evacuation shuttle disappeared into the night sky. Only essential security personnel remain in the palace. Princess Lorelei stood on the landing platform where her own evacuation shuttle waited, looking back at the crystalline spires of the palace that had been her home for her entire life. The building showed the scars of battle, shattered windows, energy weapon burns on the walls, and debris from the intense fighting that had raged throughout its corridors. "I never thought I would leave this place," she said quietly. "You're not leaving," Marcus replied. "You're ensuring that it will still be here when you come back." She turned to look at him with an expression that seemed to encompass everything that had happened since that first moment when he had stepped between her and danger. "When we come back?" she corrected. "When we come back," he agreed. As their evacuation shuttle lifted off from the palace platform, Marcus looked down at the capital city where millions of Zephyrian civilians were being evacuated to underground shelters while automated defense systems prepared for orbital bombardment. The lights of the city stretched toward the horizon, representing a civilization that had endured for millennia and that would continue to endure regardless of what the next few days might bring. Above them, Admiral Vextar's fleet continued its desperate battle against the hegemony assault force, buying precious time for the evacuation to complete. The flashes of weapons fire painted the sky with colors that had no names, while the fate of an interstellar empire hung in the balance between courage and calculation. "Status report from Admiral Vextar," came the voice of the shuttle pilot as they climbed toward orbital altitude. "Hegemony's second wave has been detected at the system's edge. Estimated arrival time is 4 hours." Princess Lyreley activated the shuttle's communication system and opened a channel to Imperial forces throughout the galaxy. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had been forged by crisis into the leader her empire needed. "This is Princess Lyreley, heir to the Zephyrian Empire, speaking to all Imperial military forces. The capital is under direct assault, but the Empire endures. We have evacuated to secure locations and are coordinating the full mobilization of our fleets. To every Imperial citizen, every allied world, and every being who believes in the principles of freedom and self-determination, we will not surrender, we will not compromise, and we will not allow tyranny to replace liberty in our galaxy." The message was transmitted across subspace communication networks to every corner of Imperial space, reaching military commanders, planetary governors, and civilian populations who needed to hear that their government had not fallen and their resistance had not ended. As the shuttle jumped to hyperspace, carrying Princess Lyreley toward the emergency command center where she would coordinate the Empire's response to its greatest crisis, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had begun as a human security specialist, been elevated to royal protector, and had now become something unprecedented in galactic history, a member of an alien species who had helped shape the survival strategy of a civilization spanning hundreds of worlds. The war that was beginning would test every alliance, every assumption, and every belief about the nature of power and resistance in the galaxy. But Marcus Chen, former Earth military officer turned guardian of an alien princess, knew one thing with absolute certainty. When the history of this conflict was written, it would record that when the Zephyrian Empire faced its darkest hour, it had not faced it alone. The human had stood between the princess and danger once again. Now together they would stand between an empire and extinction, proving that sometimes the strongest bonds are forged not by species or politics or technology, but by the simple recognition that some things are worth protecting regardless of the cost. The stars awaited their return, and the galaxy would never be the same.